Hello everyone, welcome to my overview and critique of the latest Haunted PS1 Demo Disc, Spectral Mall. This is the third demo disc created by the community, and the seventh major collaboration, ignoring the various game jams. If you're new to this and you don't know what this is, it's basically a collection of short demos created by indie developers in the style of old PlayStation 1 games, and occasionally Nintendo 64 games, with texture warping and low poly aesthetics often being the norm. The general philosophy is to explore a what-if. What if game mechanics that have been abandoned for current iterations were able to flourish and find new life? In this video, I want to go as in-depth as I can on my thoughts on each demo and offer points of constructive criticism, but I want to preface first by saying how much I respect each and every dev in this collection. Game development is extremely difficult, and with indie developers, they're often having to create every art asset and code their own games completely solo, which can be exhausting and time-consuming, but leads to experiences completely unique compared to more mainstream titles. Even if I have critiques that skew negative, I do recommend playing the demo disc yourself if any of the games here seem interesting. Many of the games are also able to be wishlisted on Steam, so that's an easy way to keep track of progress when a full version releases. I'll put relevant links in the description to assist with that. Without further ado, let's begin. Like the 2021 demo disc, this release comes with an optional launcher game, the titular Spectral Mall. From what I recall, this idea of a launcher game harkens back to works such as Namco Museum, just little spaces you can explore. I think this provides important theming and context that helps unify the collection a little bit, even if the individual games themselves vary wildly in tone and genre. The launcher game has various puzzles and secret games to find, which is pretty neat on its own. You could probably spend a good few hours in here if you really wanted to. The Spectral Mall, as it is mostly a fun, spooky time, and I would suspect the coding for it would be usable in some other horror project in the future if the creator is wanting to do that. Arcade Woah is the first of two bonus games in the collection. In it, the player character's soul has been trapped in a hellscape dimension, and you have to win it back by playing various arcade minigames and talking to the quirky denizens. I like arcade corner simulators like this a lot, and while it's deliberately limited in scope with what I believe is only 2 games, I couldn't figure out if the other 2 games were actually unlockable, it's enough of a slice for you to get the idea. No real comments, it's just neat. The second bonus game is a new demo for Sauna 2000, which had a different demo featured in the 2020 Haunted PS1 Demo Disc. I quite like that demo, so I was curious to see what changes have been made in the 2 years since. Unfortunately, my PC is pretty lower end, so the game was lagging extremely hard to the point of unplayability. Bear in mind, I'm the type of person to magic a way to get Elden Ring running on minimum settings at 15 frames per second on this thing, so it was pretty severe. I did the next best thing and just watched other people's playthroughs of it, and it really does seem interesting, with a lot more simulation aspects and leaning more into its finished aesthetic, along with reincorporating the various elements of the original demo in new ways. I don't really fault my issues with running the game with the game itself, since again, lower end PC, and it's pretty normal regardless for in-development games to have performance issues. I'm still looking forward to the final version, and I'm sure it'll be a completely unique experience like these demos already are. Nowhere, Michigan is billed as an absurdist first-person Metroidvania, and takes after the indie game Crypt Worlds in its level design and graphical presentation, with small subsections to explore and 2D cutouts to talk to. The game's other aesthetic sensibility calls to mind claymation animation, with lots of moving parts displaying their 3 dimensions, especially on the HUD, which is pretty unique and interesting to look at. Now, while billed as a Metroidvania, it's important to note how the game ties things in with its quirky dialogue and minor side quests. The guy near the double jump upgrade, for instance, wants a candy bar, and since he's so close to something that alters the gameplay, you tend to remember him and finish the quest later. Exploration, even in this limited demo, is benefited from the game's inventory system and accounting for new areas to be accessible at later times, with some secret areas and items only being obtainable from careful observation of the environment. Since movement is snappy and each individual area is overall distinct, it makes for engaging progression. There's also light combat elements to the game, mostly with these boss fights that occasionally show up. I think combat works fairly well, but it not being a focus the same way it would be in maybe Super Metroid is important to the game's overall vibe. The gun is more of a tool for exploration rather than a weapon, and most characters simply respawn if you do go out of your way to hurt them. It, as a weapon, is more treated as a last resort defense tool rather than an active thing to consider. It's not ultra kill rules is what I'm saying. As I was making this video, the 1.4.0 update for the game was released, which reworks the dialogue and item systems a bit and adds new locations. I didn't particularly have problems with either system, but I think it is good to highlight conversations that are more important with cutscene bars, and being able to see exactly what item is being used with what object helps you connect dots together rather than clicking on things randomly to see what works. For something I would want to see in the future, some sort of map would be useful to help keep track of areas that have already been explored with their associated items found. Perhaps something akin to Thief's map system, which dynamically updates based on information Garrett gains on a mission. Beyond that, the game seems perfectly fine, and I'm looking forward to the full release. Enchain, similar to a film like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which you should see, it's a masterpiece, is a swirl of genre anarchy. This game is billed as a retro first-person shooter platformer, but takes many cues from Metroidvanias and Souls-likes in its level design and core gameplay. Let's try breaking down the demo's sides. For the first-person shooting, you're given a lantern and a bevy of guns to deal with various enemies. The lantern, in addition to being a light source, is a pretty far projectile, and is the only way to truly defeat most enemies by knocking them into walls and the like. Guns are very beneficial though in order to drain health bars to get into that knockdown state, and there's even a whole mechanic with using enemies to turn the normal lantern fuel they drop into an ammo pickup based on your currently equipped weapon. For the platforming, the game has several tools that take a lot of practice to have a handle on. In addition to basic wall running and sliding, there's also a double jump hop to extend airtime, and a kick jump that can provide more height when necessary. The lantern also doubles as a grappling hook on fixed wooden surfaces. For the Souls-like aspect, the level design tends to loop in on itself with various large and small shortcuts being accessible once clearing an area, leading to a central checkpoint in the crypt that is able to be reused multiple times. This is precisely how really good areas in the various Dark Souls games function, such as Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 1 or Brum Tower in Dark Souls 2. There's also a bevy of even more advanced movement tech that I only barely started to understand by the time the demo was over. For instance, it's possible, although very difficult, to immediately backtrack to the first room after getting the lantern, which is not only accounted for with a second gun pickup and the ability to unlock a door normally requiring a key, but is also faster, since it lets you save that key for the big door instead. Things like this are very similar to Super Metroid's design, which accounted for aspects of Samus's core moveset to allow for certain areas to be done early if you have the skill to pull it off. You can even slide on enemies and do double jumps with a charged shotgun. There's a lot here to mess around with, and I'm sure in the full game it'll lead to some really interesting routes. For a critique that I did have, the second area, the Great Chasm, while a good idea to open up the gameplay with a larger surface area to explore, ends up feeling fairly basic in terms of design, which, beyond some particularly tricky jumps I felt rather silly for taking so long to solve, doesn't have a level of potential spontaneity that the crypt does. A section I did like was its wall running segment for reminding me a bit of the quite impressive wall runs in Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. And honestly, any game that reminds me of the platforming of The Two Thrones has to have great potential by default in my books. I can easily see this game striking niche lightning the same way as something like Ultra Kill has, and I'm looking forward to the final release. Blast Cats is a game heavily inspired by older 3D platformers, particularly ones from the 6th gen era like Blinks. A big thing I liked immediately is the game's aesthetics and writing. The main character Cece has some real madcap energy to her, reinforced with her being able to throw bombs and hammer various ghouls and ghastlies, which is pretty fun on its own. Like most 3D platformers from the era this was inspired by, a lot of the gameplay is a mix of various one-off ideas and gimmicks. The bonus area design, requiring at least 3 out of a total of 6 areas be done before a level is finished, means you can pick and choose which gameplay gimmicks you want to be tested on, such as standard platforming, a real wild and difficult racing minigame, and that game you play in bars when you're bored, whatever that's called. It's structured non-linearly, which helps keep levels short while providing an opportunity for choice, which I think is pretty neat. Now let's get a bit into my issues. While on the whole I think the base mechanics of jumping and bombing are pretty good, there's a few quirks with the controls I feel need to be ironed out. One of the bigger ones ended up being the camera, which, while I understand its retro intentions, ended up feeling very clunky to the point that I didn't really want to use it, even in scenarios designed for it to move. Basically, the camera will shift in a direction when you press it, and will turn 90 degrees after a double tap if you're in a bonus stage. Due to this two-step process, it ended up not feeling responsive enough when I needed it to turn quickly, which might be fixed by allowing the turn to happen immediately if you double tap, without there being a delay for the shift first. There's also a few quirks with CC's bomb kick. There's a few higher intensity scenarios, such as a boss, where I would try to lay a bomb down only for her to kick the bomb away due to my proximity to it. A way to manually disable the kick, for instance by holding down the context button, which otherwise only had a use with a specific power-up, would help make this flow better. The initial version I played also tended to have pretty unforgiving jumps, particularly in the cloud bonus level, although with the 13.9 update this was all mostly fixed, which is a good sign that the developer is aware of any problems and is working to address them. Overall, I think the game is fun, so my critiques are more a matter of refinement than anything. This demo is neat and I'm looking forward to more. Mortal Meal is a mystery-type horror game where you play as a sort of ghost of someone who appears to have been murdered, all the while stalked by a creepy lampsman who seems to be assimilating spirits. It also has really great music. The exploration and mechanics in this game are fairly light, only really requiring simple observation to proceed. From the overall vibe I get, this appears to be in the vein of B-movie horror, in that the premise itself is taken seriously, but events within it are capable of being played for comedic effect, such as when this pedestrian is suddenly run over, or the protagonist wondering how he's going to play video games even though he doesn't even remember who he is. Once a gamer, always a gamer, I guess. The full version appears like it'll be diving more into the mystery of various potential leads, which could be interesting in what it ends up doing. As it is, it's a short prelude that seems solid enough. Beeknighted is a game very much in the vein of the N64 Zelda games. You might be wondering why an N64-inspired game is included on a PS1-inspired demo disc, but this style of gameplay and graphics is of the same era as the PlayStation 1, and arbitrarily segmenting off potential projects for not adhering to a style that nobody necessarily agrees on an interpretation of would be silly. Heck, they even cross-ported classic PS1 games to the N64 at the time. Who's to say Resident Evil 2 isn't peak N64 aesthetics? But anyway, the major gimmick with Beeknighted is the lack of a jump button. Instead, the bee is able to hover short distances, with a few gameplay scenarios using that to great effect, such as needing to lower a platform to reach it. The gameplay loop, as is the case with Zelda, involves finding a dungeon item to progress. Sometimes this means directly taking down a boss, but often it just involves finding it within the dungeon itself. Unlike older Zeldas though, the items you receive are immediately hotkeyed rather than requiring searching through a menu to equip. Highlighting a specific interaction, Antonio is a pretty complex and interesting fight considering how early in the game it happens. I would almost say he's a little too difficult, but I did manage to take him down on my third attempt, so maybe it's fine. I think the game's design will end up being great if this is the standard for boss design already. So while the game overall is pretty fun, I did have a few issues. First, the game really needs a settings menu to adjust the window size and controls. Not being able to resize the window or properly click away from it without Alt-Tab is a bit annoying, and the button layout, while not terrible for keyboard, would still benefit from being able to be remapped. In terms of the raw controls themselves, I think it'd be nice if you could grab vines while in the air rather than requiring grabbing them from the very bottom, since logically if you're able to reach them by hovering, then you should be able to grab them. Not having a general ledge grab is fine though, since the game is balanced around the distance you can currently hover. I see the game's potential and I think it'll reach it. 10 Dead Doves is a narrative-driven horror game about two friends going on a final mountain expedition, which quickly gets derailed due to mysterious otherworldly circumstances. I was pretty impressed by the game's overall visual presentation and mechanics. The animations are really good for such a low-budget game, helped by the developers themselves having experience of animation, and the interface is nearly identical to larger-budget projects like The Walking Dead or Life is Strange. The mechanics inherently lend themselves well to light exploration, examination, and lots of dialogue. For a critique of the overall story as presented in the demo, the implication I get is that this is the last time Marcus will be going out hiking like this, my read being a terminal illness such as cancer that he hasn't told his family about yet. The opening scene I take as a metaphor for how Marcus's life is on a fixed track, and trying to do escapism through hanging out with his old buddy is only delaying the inevitable.
A crack of thunder in the air around us touched our wrists on his great manuscript.
Marcus's interactions with Sean seem fraught intentionally, in that it seems a little awkward and tense due to implied past events. But I think to an extent Sean's actions cross a line into arbitrary railroading rather than him in character being kind of annoying, such as when he somehow throws his pocket knife over a really large wall after they both saw and ran away from a monster. Characters conflicting and doing irrational things is normal to any story. Heck, that's like half the reason why I like Life is Strange, but it needs to be tempered occasionally to not feel really weird and gamey. These characters are friends and joke around a lot, so having more moments where that is conveyed in a way that doesn't come off as hostile ribbing would be good. Perhaps this is already planned to be addressed in the future at the full release, so maybe I'm just misreading something that'll be obvious later. An unambiguous problem though is the subtitles, especially for a game as story-heavy as this one. The subtitles are very small and hard to read against the background, with many longer lines that are unbroken, and the alternate text for reading posters and the like lack proper formatting. This even becomes a problem with the dialogue interface, which is small text that is white on gray. Looking directly at Life is Strange's settings, there's font size options and a semi-opaque overlay to help subtitles stand out from the background, and the text formatting when reading posters is mostly clear and legible in all cases. I don't even think Life is Strange is necessarily a perfect example, but it's a bare minimum standard that is necessary for people who have hearing or sight issues, and I hope the developers address this in the future. Overall though, the demo shows promise, and the game is due to have a Kickstarter sometime in the future, which I'll probably end up backing when the time comes. Gob ended up surprising me the most out of the collection. Described as point-and-click mechanics without the pointing and clicking, the game initially feels rather cryptic due to it approaching the interface in a novel way. See, Gob in their messy, beautifully rendered little home is able to hold two items, and can combine them together by simply pressing the corresponding hand buttons together, or interact with an object individually by having a free hand and doing the same thing. It sounds confusing at first, and admittedly, I think the game would feel more approachable if it started with the gamepad screen to show you what you can do, but it's absolutely admirable to design an interface without using any words, trusting in your ability to figure things out on your own, calling to mind another world for the Amiga and its sensibilities. You very much feel like a curious kid in your efforts to solve the game's riddles, which helps you relate to Gob's perspective. This is a really interesting experimental game, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it when it's finished. Dead Letter Department joins the very small pantheon of typing-based horror games, and of the ones I know about, this seems the most confident in presenting a serious tone. You work as someone who's hired to type in letters on lost mail that the computer has trouble processing, while strange events happen in front and around you. I mostly found the typing to be fine, but since I was focusing so much on getting the lettering right so I could get through the queue properly, I never really found myself to be scared when like a face popped up for a frame, or the lights started flashing or what have you. Mostly just kind of annoyed I was getting distracted from the work. There's some really interesting lighting and effects going on with the environments themselves, so I'm assuming this is set up for a larger horror experience. It's a unique one, and hey, a good way to practice typing if you want to. Sorry We're Open is a pretty unique blend of a roguelike, a manager sim, and an RPG, requiring balancing of various random events alongside resource management in order to uncover mysteries in a less than innocuous grocery chain. Battles themselves aren't necessarily difficult, but they require a lot of planning in order to go well due to how quickly the manager's HP can be depleted from even simple encounters, and how most abilities you're able to use require cash to do so. Passing turns themselves becomes sort of a puzzle, since the free goof-off action directly damages the manager. I found a way to circumvent this problem is using various items to avoid spending cash or HP, which inevitably leads to stockpiling on trash and cigarettes in order to have free damage and health regeneration. Just like reality. The game also surprised me in the depths of its secrets and dungeon exploration. For example, these bags of money you randomly find lying around aren't just a simple gimmick to give you money, they belong to somebody, and willing to part with that money rewards you with a powerful union skill, reinforcing through game mechanics what thematically is going on with the story. This is a really interesting concept for an RPG, and I'm sure the full release will be just as interesting. Fear the Spotlight is a survival game where you need to hide from a monster while solving various puzzles in an abandoned, burnt school. It reminds me a lot of the early Resident Evil games, with the important note that you can't run or defend yourself in any meaningful way, meaning going undercover such as behind desks and various objects is essential to survive. Having the verbs of the game be hide, interact, and examine keeps the scope fairly maintainable. It can often be tempting for indie devs to introduce a lot of systems that interrelate with each other, a combat system being one, but it can lengthen development time and in some situations be detrimental to the game itself, particularly for horror games. I played horror games that are immersive sims, and they're pretty fun and interesting, but that's often after a very protracted dev cycle. Fear the Spotlight keeps this in mind and has interactions with the main enemy limited. Some areas necessitate avoiding them, while others are completely focused on puzzle solving, which can sometimes blend into each other in interesting ways. I don't really have any specific critiques of the game as is, since it's so short, but it overall worked for me in terms of its gameplay, although I think for a full release, some other complexity might end up being necessary, since the pacing of a demo versus a full game is always different. The devs are looking to expand the game after the positive reception to the demo, and I think it'll end up being a fun time once it's done. Perlin Festival is a rather surreal exploration game, where you play as a character named Pluto exploring somewhere called The Noise. In design, it owes a lot to Yume Nikki, the 2004 freeware exploration game that a lot of indie projects are inspired by. The difference with Perlin, of course, being it's 3D and has a heavier focus on dialogue. This demo overall is interesting, with a few small side quests you can do and some surprising bits of metatextuality. There's a lot of expected demo area restrictions, and no real ending as far as I could tell, so I overall didn't have much to say on the game beyond it working for me personally. I love these type of exploration games, so I'm sure the full release will be good. Future Reality is a flight racer horror game with a unique mechanic where gobs of goop can be used to either repair your craft or give you a boost in speed. The initial version I tried ran unspeakably slowly on my admittedly rather weak computer, but a recent update seemed to fix the problem and the game runs more or less perfectly. I'm really not experienced enough with racing games to give an assessment on the game's controls, but what I played seemed responsive enough and would definitely interest fans of the old F-Zero games. Give it a go if you're interested. House of Necrosis initially starts as a very clear homage to Resident Evil 1, before quickly diving into its own set of gameplay. Essentially, House of Necrosis is an older-style roguelike in the vein of Toroneko's Mystery Dungeon, primarily about traversing a large dungeon and needing to rely on various random items and weapons dropped from enemies, and also just lying around. Resource management is key, since there's limited ways to heal and even more limited inventory space. Certain items can be upgraded by combining them together, such as the various guns and melee weapons, which increases their overall damage. There's also various accessories with powerful effects like immunity to poison, and serums which vary wildly in utility and require being identified to avoid a bad result. The game's overall difficulty skews pretty easy if you're patient and careful about conserving resources, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there's a few elements that I feel are a bit too strong. Sleeping pills allow you to reset a floor while keeping all your items, essentially putting you ahead if you're already doing well. And mixed red and green herbs are always a full heal rather than 10 HP, which becomes increasingly more unbalanced the higher your health climbs. I also wanted to note that the final boss of the demo is a carbon copy of Dead Hand from Ocarina of Time, which, while a decent fight in terms of the game's mechanics, feels really derivative and out of place in terms of inspiration. Overall, I had fun with the demo, and I think a more fleshed out experience with the dungeon will sort out most of the difficulty curve issue. Baabosaangjaar, a name I definitely mispronounced, is a rather surrealist exploration game that toys with a lot of conventions of not just video game design, but language and memory. If you were around during the YouTube poop days, you'll be familiar with how those videos structure and reinterpret language for comedic effect and occasional sly commentary. I think it's easy to write off the game's supposed shitpost writing as all memes, but underneath that is surprisingly complex layers of sadness and meditations on reality. This game's about childhood trauma, and how technology is able to modify memory through its imperfections. The digitalization and exploration of these videotapes creates false memories, people who don't exist, and people who did exist but now don't. We experience time linearly, but how we engage with it is constantly in flux before it becomes fixed. In other words, we always exist in the present, the future doesn't exist, and we cope with the past. Who are the people in a recording? Their film, or pixels of data, abstractions of real people. And if your memory starts to go, abstractions are all you have to rely on. If you can't remember your past, the trauma existing there is able to be replicated.
Yes. Hello. Hey. No. Yes. Hello. Yes.
I found this demo to be very impactful. The demo for They Speak from the Abyss is a short Prelude chapter where a woman named Vanessa is drawn into the world of demons. Gameplay is in the style of older adventure game titles, where the camera is first person and movement takes place on a grid. I really like this style of control due to how it limits both the camera and movement, which in a horror game can make things feel tense if you're in an unfamiliar area. The demo itself is only set up for the game's atmosphere and story, meaning there's no RPG mechanics implemented yet, although there is light puzzle solving to open doors. Even with that concession though, I found this game to be very engaging due to all the weird creepy denizens you can speak with. The pixel art done for this game is extremely good, showing very macabre details. This is a place where humans suffer, and you can really feel it in this art and in the writing. The only mild thing I noticed was that denizens will fully repeat their dialogue if you interact with them multiple times, which includes Killer giving you multiple knives with their first interaction. It's not really that big a deal though, and I've definitely wishlisted this game for its full release already. Miracle Bug in the Electric Limbo is a short exploration game about being lost in a limbo, where you talk to various creatures and solve basic puzzles. The game's aesthetic feels very melancholic. I think the exact term would be a form of hauntology. Of all things, it specifically reminds me of playing Phantasy Star 2 on an old PC, which as a kid was really weird and confusing since I could barely read the text and barely understood what a game even was. I imagine if I played a game like Miracle Bug as a kid, it'd stick in my brain the same way that like Yume Nikki does now, and I mean that as a sincere compliment to the strength of the game's aesthetics. Being able to evoke specific, tangible emotions from such simple art is very powerful. For the overall gameplay, as I said, it's mostly exploration and basic puzzles. But to cap off the demo, there's a battle to ascend with some form of angel, which is done in the style of short WarioWare minigames you select via tarot cards. To be honest, I didn't really understand this gameplay shift. It felt rather abrupt compared to what came before, and maybe that was an intentional feeling to convey since this is a sudden, spontaneous thing to be trying to do in the world of this game, but I feel it's the type of element better served by introducing this mechanic more gradually. Miracle Bug overall was pretty interesting. I'm not sure what the developer intends to do in the future, but I'll be sure to keep an eye out for their next projects. Northstar Courier takes place in a small town where you deliver packages to the quirky residents, along with taking photos of various strange creatures about. Its art style immediately reminds me of Mega Man Legends, with really bright colors and blocky character design. The town itself, while again small, has interesting progression to it, where new areas are unlocked on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of secrets to uncover with simple observation. You can even collect music to listen to like Moon Remix RPG Adventure, which is all pretty good. I only had 2 comments on the overall gameplay. First, I think the main character's walking and running speed really needs to be increased a bit when not on the scooter. I understand the intent of more methodical, contemplative movement at first, but it ends up coming off as a little tedious for me. I also wish there was a way to view the photos that you take since it's such an important gameplay mechanic, to the point that the computer lists specific creatures you've taken photos of, but you can't actually see the photos that you took. Beyond that, this is a pleasant time with an undercurrent of horror that I'm looking forward to seeing expanded in the future. Mothered ended up being so interesting that I immediately bought the full game, so consider this a review of that instead of the demo. Spoilers for the full game, and also a quick content warning on brief discussions of parental abuse. The best way to summarize this game is as a modern adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, with many of the same fears of technology baked into it. You end up feeling sympathy for Frankenstein's monster due to the machinations created by flawed people to bring about their creation. You're playing as a synthetic robot who houses the core of the family's late daughter, Liana, in a long line of failed attempts to bring her back to life. This is due to the dehumanization done to the robotic part of the symbiotic relationship, where quote-unquote inhuman actions done by you as the player controlling them is treated as monstrous acts. The way I read this, I think even before Liana died, her parents were being abusive towards her, and their continual attempts to get things back to the way it was is painting a rosy picture on a cracked frame. Her father didn't even attend her funeral because he was so convinced he could bring her back. Every single time Liana truly does start to self-actualize within the confines of this nightmare of a reality, she is reset without her parents ever realizing she was always in there, and with enough time and care, they would have had their daughter back. This gets additionally reinforced with the surrealism of the game's aesthetics, the unnerving way the mother moves and the obvious texture issue on her arm, the glitchiness of the environments. All of these interactions you're having with this family are robotic and stilted. Because they've gone through the motions so many times, they've convinced themselves that you're the robot. Rather than holding on to this ideal being the source of the problem, the mother is forever trapped playing this role while the father goes and repeats it, forcing her to perform the loss of their daughter over and over, which inevitably always leads to her performing abusive actions to prove that her daughter is not there. Unable to let go of the memory of what might have happened, they're all trapped in an infinite cycle of trauma. The game's true ending breaks the cycle and humanizes the core that used to contain Liana, and the robotic interface you've been interacting with. Through a metatextual miracle by the player's actions, they're freed and ultimately accepted by their father rather than forced to repeat the cycle. This is deep, complicated writing, and is probably one of my favorite new horror experiences this side of detention. The only thing I'll note is that I couldn't do whatever the sequel to Mothered was because, when returning to the demo, the box at the beginning simply wouldn't spawn. I don't really know what's going on with that, but yeah. The full game is available on Steam right now, and you'd be doing yourself a disservice by ignoring it. So that's every game in this collection. Hopefully my critiques of every game were fair and understandable, since I really do want to see these projects and developers flourish in the future, and I would never want to demotivate someone from that alone. Game development is extremely difficult, and being able to see the good alongside the bad is important. Anyway, that's all. Have a nice day.